really a genuine honour to have Richard with us today. He's chosen the topic, tourism and the visitor economy, which is the subject which he knows backwards, both in terms of his day-to-day work running Putnam in the Forest, but also, of course, professionally through all his multitude of diverse institutions he's chaired in his work in the House of Lords and the European Parliament. In the press release that I issued before this talk, I made a selection of those titles that seemed most appropriate for his topic today, covering conservation and protection of antiquities and historic buildings and the arts and culture and conservation and farming the uplands. And I listed some, and I'll just repeat them for you and the Zoomers, because I think it's an extraordinary diversity of institutions he's had very, very serious responsibilities for. He's been a member of the Lake District Planning Board from 1984 to 89, where he chaired its Development Cultural Committee. He was in the European Parliament from 1890. It's got white hair, but it's got that. 1989 to 1994. And Minister of the House of Lords Department for National Heritage from 1999 to 2004. Chairman of the Cumbria Tourist Board from 2004 to 2019, 15 years period. Chair until very recently as the Cumbria Local Enterprise Partnership, and President of Historic Buildings and Places, and served as the Vice Lord Lieutenant of Cumbria since 2013. At a time when many of us have spent hours glued to the television watching the Olympics and the exploits of our sporting heroes, I wonder whether the term Olympian could also be applied to certain individuals such as Richard, who devote so much of their time to our well-being, improving our lives in Cumbria. He will be one of our very rare speakers not to be wedded to PowerPoint, pressing buttons, talking to the wall. He's going to talk to you and our Zoomers, and I'm very pleased he's going to do that. And he'll speak from his heart, no doubt using all his considerable skills as a barrister. I know he wants to engage with this audience in Watermillet, and also from those who are watching online. We'll just have to play it by ear. I know if there are points that you would like to raise while he's speaking, I'm sure he'd be very happy to deal with that. He wants it to be an interactive process, not sort of spouting from on high. He'd like to have some sort of interactive dialogue. So please feel free to ask any questions during his talk, and we'll have a question and answer at the end. So without further ado, thank you very much indeed for coming. We're looking forward to hearing your wisdom tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, Tim, thank you. I'm not quite sure you'll hear much wisdom, but never mind about that. Anyway, delighted to be here this evening. I didn't realise all those months ago and agreed to come, but I hadn't thought that the Olympics would be on. And I'm actually quite happy to not be watching the Olympics, although I quite enjoy it in small doses. And also, I hadn't realised it was going to be such a wonderful evening. And that anybody who drove along the side of Ullswater coming here this evening will realise it's actually much better to be out there enjoying what is a fantastic prospect than it is sitting in a village hall listening to some old so-and-so like me. But most speakers come and have give a great peroration, and they're trying to pass on a message. And I'm not sure I'm really doing that this evening, because I have an opportunity to kind of articulate some musings I've been having about tourism, and in particular its relationship to the Lake District, but more generally in respect of what nowadays are called cultural aspects of life, old buildings and so on. Because I'm slightly uneasy about the relationship between the two, while recognizing that as far as this community is concerned, the visitor economy is incredibly important. As far as Cumbria is concerned, This is something I've picked up from the lab. It's worth about £4.1 billion a year, and it's about 13% of the country's gross value added. I mean, it really matters that it works effectively. And yet, I can't help but wonder whether we're going quite in the right direction with it. And this is something that I've been sort of had niggling away in the back of my mind. And then suddenly, it seems that in about the last 2 or 3 months, all over the newspapers, there has been concern reported from all around Europe about the impact of tourism on the communities to which they go. And so I thought, well, perhaps I wasn't such an outlier as I thought I might have been. And if that's right, then what do people who are actually engaged in it all think? Because if it is your livelihood, or a very significant part of your livelihood, it really matters that things work properly. And it matters not only in the short term, but also in the longer term. And what I hope we can do is at the end of my remarks, and I don't hold out any particular magic in any of them, then you will explain to me, and if necessary, debate among yourselves, what you think. And the one thing I'm absolutely sure about is we're not going to come to any conclusions tonight. Now, as Tim said, I'm a Cumbrian. I've always lived in this county. I've worked away, but it's always been home. And it's now rather a long time ago when I started, as I am very conscious is of my birthday yesterday. Now, Ullswater plays quite a part in my memories because I went to school at Beulah, where Miles's aunt ran what I think in the old days, and if you'll permit me to say so, used to be called a dame school. And from about 5 till about 8, I used to go daily pilgrimage to Beulah, and we walked all around that end of the lake. And it was a curious time, as in everyone's childhood, that never rained at all in the Lake District that part at that time. And then subsequently, as Tim said, I was appointed to the Lake District Planning Board in '84. And I remember my brother saying to me, "Oh, congratulations on becoming one of the 30 most unpopular people in Cumberland." And I chaired for 4 years the Development Control Committee. So I did actually see a lot of the Lake District. The great thing about being on that committee was you actually had to go on site visits all over. And the bits of the West I'd never been to before, and I've hardly ever been to since. And it was all very interesting. And then when I was in the European Parliament, representing obviously this area, I was, but not all the time, but some of the time on the Agriculture Committee. And Agricultural Committee was touching on a lot of the issues to do with agro-environmental aspects that are of major concern to us here now. And then I've had this period on the left. And it has made it clear to me just how important the visitor economy is to this community in Cumbria. And that when you think that a lot of the biggest activity in terms of money turnover is BAE Systems and Sellafield, it puts it even into a clearer and more important clarity that, that just how this all matters to Cumbria as it used to be and still is if you're Lord Lieutenant Sahel. And then we've obviously, we as a family have lived in this area since really the middle of the 16th century and had land in Cumbria since that time. And we also had a hotel business and as well as running Hutton in the Forest. So I like to think I've got some understanding of some of the issues. And we live in a world where almost everything is changing quite dramatically. And I think the underlying questions we need to ask ourselves is how are these changes affecting what happens here? And then in terms of what we are doing, if we think it's important, and I think I'll come on to that, and I think we do think it's important, how should that relate to everything else that's going on in the world? Because we aren't a place which has necessarily the loudest voice or the biggest clout when it comes to policy. But we'll come on to that later. Now, some time ago, I bought a copy of some photographs of the Lake District by somebody called Gwen Bertelsmann, who I don't think was a well-known photographer, these photographs turned up somewhere, and she had, I think, lived in London, and she had died, I think, leaving all the negatives behind. Some relation found them, and they ended up belonging, but ended up in the hands of the Friends of the Lake District, who published these black and white photos of this area in the late 40s and 50s. So just about the time that I was growing up and can remember. And it's extraordinary. Pictures of old men in tweed caps and tweed suits sometimes in weather like this, haymaking with a rake, and lots of reaper binders, and agriculture that's completely vanished. And it's not that long ago. It's been this enormous change in the way the Lake District is looked after by the people on the ground. And I can remember as a child, my father talking about his earlier life. He first came here in the 1930s when he left university, having come to Hutton after a cousin had left it to him. And he recorded telling me once that he'd been staying with a university friend of his who was one of the sons of G.M. Trevelyan, the great historian. And he was at that time, he was in big wheel in the National Trust. And over lunch, he's told the assembled group, including my father, I'm off to go and see Mrs. Healis. And then he said, does any of you know who Mrs. Healis is? And they were pretty, sort of high-minded, intelligent group. And they all said no. And so that it was a different sort of world. Now, that was the world, and I think this is important, which stimulated the establishment of the national parks. After all, if you think about the national park movement, its roots go back into the late 19th century and into people like Ruskin. And that was the Lake District that they were concerned to preserve. And of course, we live in a world now which is different. The Lake District now is clearly different from what it was then. And I think we ought to ask ourselves the question, what is it evolving into? Now, some of you may know the architect and writer Clough Williams-Ellis. Anyway, he wrote a book called England and the Octopus in 1928. And the frontispiece is a couple of Punch cartoons, or two scenes out of a Punch cartoon. And the first one is headed 1914, Mr. William Smith answers the call to preserve his native soil. And there's a picture of the man going off to war and a wonderful pastoral scene in the background. And then underneath it was a second image, which is 1919. Mr. William Smith comes back again to see how well he has done it. And there's a picture of a kind of urban slum. And so the concern is very real and is long-standing. Now, what is interesting, I think, to go back to what I said at the beginning, is that I've been thinking about this, and suddenly we find that all around the world, people are concerned not about necessarily that kind of degradation, but by the impact of the tourist industry, which is both the salvation of many areas, including this one, that is economically, in ways that I didn't appreciate. And if you think about things, there was a recent supplement in the Financial Times, headed whole page, "The Rise of Tourism Phobia in Europe. Record visitor numbers are provoking angry protests in Spain, and policymakers are beginning to take action. But rejecting a sector that is the economic lifeblood in many places is dangerous." And if you think about it, I've seen over the last couple of months or so reports about local opposition articulated on the streets and so on against tourism in Venice, and in Spain, in Majorca and Barcelona, in Amsterdam, and at Sintra in Portugal. And that's just the ones I've picked up. So there is something happening which is not restricted to me in Cumbria and using in my bath. And I think the question I want to try and explore is, first of all, is it a real concern? Are there real, genuine issues behind that? And if there are, what on earth do you do about it? Now, of course, people have always travelled, and the wish to see new things in the world is a very fundamental one in the human psyche. And of course, we're moving into a world, as we all know, where taken as a whole, travel is ever cheaper and easier. And I think on balance, that's a good thing. I'm not criticizing that. And this really goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. I mean, the ancient Greeks explored the Western Mediterranean in very small boats a long, long time ago. Romans, after all, came here long before they invaded with Claudius's invasion. You know, not only the Julian Caesar, the earlier one. The Vikings used to cross Europe in the Dark Ages without any apparent problem at all. And it's recorded that Vikings who knew each other in Norway and Sweden used to meet in Constantinople, one of them having gone via Novgorod in Russia, and the other having gone by Sicily. So that's something which isn't new. And again, we know things like Canterbury Tales, the pilgrimage is and always has been an important incentive to travel. And in some ways, I think a lot of people, particularly in the sort of 19th century, came up to the Lake District as a form of pilgrimage. And indeed, you've really got to see the riots take place at the Hajj recently to see that the tourists aren't always peaceful people. And there is a history of tension between host communities and visitors. So what has happened in the past in this bit of England? And after all, we are here in England's premier national park and one of the most important visitor destinations in the country. And it is quite interesting because as far as I can see, in the sort of 17th century, the Lake District was a pretty rough, poor place. I don't know if any of you have seen a book called Famine in Tudor and Stuart England by somebody called Appleby. I mean, in the late 17th century, there is evidence that people were dying of starvation in the Lake District. And that puts everything into some kind of perspective. And it was only later in the 18th century, as far as I can see, when it became the thing to do to visit the Lake District amongst other parts of the country. And that is, I think, because the wars with the French meant that the fashion for taking the Grand Tour wasn't really any longer possible because you couldn't get through France. And I thought it was quite interesting. I looked up at the introduction to West's Guide to the Lakes, which is late 18th century. And I just read you two paragraphs. It begins, the guidebook, since persons of genius, taste, and observation began to make the tour of their own country and to give such pleasing accounts of the natural history and improving state of the northern part of the kingdom, the spirit of visiting them has diffused itself among the curious of all ranks, particularly the taste for one branch of a noble artist, landscape painting, in which the genius of Britain rivals that of ancient Greece and modern Rome, induces many to visit the lakes of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, there to contemplate in alpine scenery finished in nature's highest tints, the pastoral and rural landscapes exhibited in all their styles, the fair, the rude, the romantic, and the sublime. Well, you can't get much better than that. Having said that, you wouldn't get many visitors to come here these days on the basis of that prospectus. And again, it was interesting that in a sort of generation later, but in Wordsworth's Guide, when the fashion for travelling extended right through British society. And that's partly, I think, because the Industrial Revolution meant that there were more people who had the resources and therefore could have the time to be able to do it. And I'm very glad to say that in the introduction to the guide, it concludes, happy proportion of component parts is indeed noticeable among the landscapes of the north of England. And in this characteristic, essential to a perfect picture, they surpass the scenes of Scotland and in a still greater degree, those of Switzerland. So that's all very good. And of course, the effect of all that has been that ever since, numbers have, in general terms, increased very substantially. And of course, as the country got richer, then more people travelled and so on and so forth. And then you saw in the 19th century, I think, quite an interesting shift, which was the development of what you call manufacturers' villas around the lakes, particularly around Windermere, which has been well recorded by Joe Morden Crook in his book, The Rise of the Nouveau Riche. Again, a lot of it was stimulated, I think, by sort of Oxbridge reading parties. And then, the invention of rock climbing took place up here. And at the same time, Bowness and Windermere and Keswick developed into centres, but nowadays they've been called hubs for visitor economy. And then as things like Lancashire holidays became more widespread, then they became a focus for them. And it's all been very well, interestingly described by Marshall and Walton in their book of History of Cumbria, ending 1830 to 1945, I think it is. So what has happened is that the visitor economy in the past here has changed quite significantly over what in one sense is quite a long period, but actually in historic time is not so. Now, what does that tell us about what is going on now? Because it seems to me absolutely clear that the character of the visitor economy in this area is changing again. And this has an impact both on the sort of nuts and bolts of the economy itself, but also on its impact on the rest of the landscape. And in a world where, as I said, travel is becoming increasingly easy, we're seeing more and more people visiting, and these are all generalizations, and you can all find examples to prove me wrong. But visitors are coming from further and further afield. I mean, we know that for some years in the past, there's been really quite a lot of Chinese. One of the problems being is they don't seem to spend that much money when they get here. That's another point. And yet, interestingly, we're finding variations of our concerns are being experienced elsewhere. And as I said, what can we learn from them? What can they learn from us? And how can we then try and find a sensible way moving forward? Because the more people you have, they impose greater physical pressure on the place. And in a world now where place is becoming rather an important political phenomenon, and rightly so, that's interesting. The economic implications for all this are perfectly obvious. On the one hand, it's bringing money into the community. On the other hand, is it the right sort of money in the right form? And are the profits generated remaining here, or are they going elsewhere? And then, of course, there's enormous pressure on what you might call the natural world. And part of that is farming, but it's not, it goes much further than that. How should we respond to all that? Now, as far as sort of physical change is concerned, and the planning system, we're living at a time where the planning system is under very considerable attack. And having chaired the planning board's planning committee 4 years some time ago, it's quite interesting to try to think back to those days and then compare it to what is happening now. And I was talking to a friend only last night who had been on the planning board after my time, and he said, I think we were doing it pretty well then, but now everything is being frayed at the edges. The planning system itself is under enormous pressure. It's become increasingly complicated, which makes everything both much more drawn out and much more expensive. And at the same time, as we know, things like building work is getting more and more expensive. And the cost of doing things has gone shooting up. Now, as it all changes, what does this mean for the community here? And I think there's a case for arguing, and you may disagree, that the effect of all these additional policies and expenses is that in order for our economy to survive, because there is no other source of revenues, whether you're a farmer or running a guest house, is that you just do more. The effect of the world we're in is that the winning seems to be achieved by those who are the biggest and the strongest. And the effect of the implementation of the rules of bureaucracy is pushing economic activities in that direction. Is that a good thing? Because what really is saying is that you've got to keep on expanding all the time. And before you know where you are, it becomes a ratchet. And that can be a dangerous thing and a dangerous place to be on, particularly if you are working in an industry where the raw material of your industry, the people don't come to the Lake District in very general terms to stay in a guest house in Keswick. They come to look at what we see outside the window here. There are, I mean, obviously there's some who come to Long Clun and the equivalents, but the basic industry is based on the landscape. And the extraordinary thing is that the landscape is really a byproduct of farming and land management. And it's one of the few industries where the byproduct is actually worth a great deal more than the main product. And it's not paid for. And of course, one of the great problems, and it is a real problem, is that if you want to recognize that, how on earth do you charge? Because it seems to me that a lot of people, and I don't blame the people running the tourist industry for this, are getting something very good, really very cheap. And it's rather like the arguments that we're hearing deployed about national museums. People who visit our country, who don't pay our taxes, get in free. Well, it's jolly good for everybody else, but is it good for the museums? I'm all for people in this country being able to come and visit the Lake District, but how can we properly ensure that the people who are living and working here are rewarded in basically an appropriate way? If you work in the health service, it's absolutely clear, and we see this that's going on now, that doctors and medical staff have a position where they can extract more wages, and they may well deserve it. That's not the point of my point. The point is that they are in a position where if they are wanting increased income, they can achieve it. But if you're running a farm business in Cumbria, you're absolutely caught, because there's really no way you can sensibly latch in to the value that is being created and the revenues that are being generated in a way which, frankly, I suspect represents true return on what they're doing. And that, I think, is one of the really difficult problems. And then it is exacerbated by the housing, because people here want to live and work near where they work, just as they do anywhere else. If you want to get a house in the Lake District, we all know it is enormously expensive. It's one of the most expensive places you can find for rural property in the heart of the Lake District. And yet you need people to live and work there. And at the same time, we live in the world where owning your house is an important thing. And yet it's effectively impossible either to buy a house or increasingly even to let a house if you are on a number of the less well-paid jobs, which we find in this community. And doesn't seem to me that the politicians have really got their grips on, got grips on this, because you could build 1 million houses in the Lake District, and I don't think you'd solve the housing problem we have, because other money would come pouring in and acquire them. We've got somehow to find a way that the part of the housing, in my view, the housing stock is restricted to people who live and work here, some for let and some to own. And it's got to be separate from the wider marketplace, where there is no possible way in the current climate that people here can get into it. And it matters because a lot of jobs, be they in land management in various forms and or in tourism, the people who are working in it have to be moderately close to where the work is. And you don't want to end up, as we're increasingly finding, with large numbers of people in the visitor economy, starting the day in a bus from Workington. And on top of that, increasingly there is problems because the money isn't really making it attractive enough for people to work in the visitor economy. And the visitor economy, it paradoxically doesn't seem really able to generate greater wages because the market won't bear it. So it's a kind of, it shouldn't, that problem shouldn't exist, but it does seem to. And so what should you do? And that, I mean, there is a real bind, and I don't think anything that either political party was saying in the run-up to the last election deals with the actual problems on the ground in places like this. And if you find that the indigenous population is alienated, using that word in a neutral sense, from the visitors, you're storing up trouble for yourself. Witness what's been happening in Barcelona and places, which is where one of the biggest tensions appear to be. And that is something I don't understand. And of course, as far as the farming side of it is concerned, everybody has been blaming the common agricultural policy. I think, and having had some first-hand experience of it, unfairly, because the common agricultural policy was established in the late 1940s, when, just as here in the late 17th century, people were starving to death in Europe. Post-war Europe, in the late 1940s, in that very cold winter, people died of starvation on the continent. So you can hardly blame the politicians in the 1950s for making sure that food security was right at the top of their list. And there was a thing called the Mansell Plan, which was the European Commissioner, you will know about this, which was designed to increase output. Then, as things evolved, we ended up in a world where we then, in this country, used to sneer about peasant farmers on the continent. But I don't think they were quite as stupid as we thought they were, because the UK government was a great believer in industrial agriculture and getting things bigger and bigger. And the effect of that was to knock back farming around here and the associated land management aspects, which were all being paid for essentially through commodity prices. And so we got ourselves into a terrible muddle that there isn't a proper recognition. It's coming, but it's still not there, of the need to properly pay for and reward people doing the things that actually are underpinning this important national asset. And I always think, so that, you know, the problem is the farming community got into a frame of mind where it sneered at the framework which agriculture has set, doing a combination of jobs worth crossed with girls with clipboards. And it was not helpful to anybody that arose, and it has done. And where we go from here, I'm not sure, because we know now from listening to our great lords and masters and so on that we're seeing a reconfiguration of rural policy and agricultural policy. And I think it's perfectly obvious what needs to be done in very general terms, which is a bit of everything. But it's got to be paid for, and it's got to be organized in a sensible and coherent way. And somehow nothing is coming together. And in the meantime, I'm concerned that it'll take so long, and it will get there eventually in some way, that there will be big changes. And as far as I said, the visitor economy is concerned, this stuff is the raw material on which this important second industry is based. People come for the Lake District. They want the walls to stand up. They don't want it to be covered with blanket deforestation of Sitka spruce and so on. And then, of course, the thing that we often forget, and I think is actually very important, is the fact that we are here in a national park, and a national park is for everybody. It's easy to envisage a system where visitor economy is focused on the richest, because you've got to try and leverage as much money as you can out of the visitors. That makes sense. But we've also got to have a place for 18-year-olds who want to go rock climbing and fell walking and all that sort of thing. And how do you do it? It's not obvious. And if you have an approach to farm diversification, which we've had in this country, which has basically said the diversification to support the farming business is something that ought to be physically on or more or less adjacent to the farm, you end up, if you're not careful, with a system of diversification that means it yokes one badly paying activity with another badly paying activity. And that isn't a very good recipe, I don't think, for taking things forward. So, coming to the end of my comments, it seems there is an extraordinary triangular relationship, and is vis-a-vis the tourist industry here, between land and farming, the visitor economy, and housing policy. and it's out of kilter now. There are all kinds of extraneous factors that will play into this. But what we've got to do is somehow get the thing back into balance. And there must be a risk, I won't say any more than that we end up killing the goose that lays the golden egg. There is a golden egg for this community from the visitor economy, but we've got to be very careful the way in which it evolves, so that we ensure that not only for the next 5 years, but for the next 55 or 100 years, we have a national park which still merits its World Heritage status. And part of that World Heritage status inscription is because of the cultural characteristics of the communities that live here. And at the same time, it ensures they survive, but not simply as something in a kind of waxwork show. It's jolly difficult. And I don't for a minute suggest that I have many of the answers at my fingertips, but I'd be interested to know whether you think that basic analysis may be correct. And if so, what things do you think are important to be kept in mind when thinking about it? But I've now done about half an hour, haven't I?
Yeah.
So, which I think was
35 minutes, yeah,
was what you wanted.
No,
I hope it didn't ramble too much. And but I genuinely want to know what you think.
Should we give a little round of applause? So we're going to have a very, very lively debate. I've got 4 or 5 hands already going up now, and I've got, I don't know how many Zoomers. Let's start. Yes, we will.
I've just been to Venice.
Okay.
For 4 nights. It's €5 a night to stay in Venice. I think we should be doing that. And not just for hotels, but also for campsites, for people on campsites.
Is €5 enough?
€5 per person.
Is €5 enough? I mean,
Let me just stop a second, just because it's going to be very difficult with our Zoom. So I will either repeat your question, or Richard, just to make sure that people online can hear what you're saying. So she asked, well, she's just come back from Venice, had to pay €5 a night, which she thinks is too little, probably per person. It works or doesn't.
is it? Or, it's mental health. Yeah. But yes, who's next? You're orchestrating this.
Mike.
Yeah. My colleague and I, Ron Kenny, do a lot of work with the BMC, British Mountaineering Council. One of the pressures coming up is to look at the aspect of freedom to roam, because the aspect of the freedom to roam is not as many people would wish, even in the Lake District. And so we ran a conference about a month ago to debate these issues. We put together a conference with landowners and the new generation of farmers and the outdoor people and so on. And there were some very interesting ideas coming up. And it looks as though the environment isn't in quite as much risk as we had assumed, because as the sheep population reduces, then there will be an overgrowth that will prevent people running everywhere, trampling everything down. Just switching back now, as you say, you in your opening comments, you weren't so much presenting a theme, but giving us an overview of everything. And every other country in the world that I've been to, which is about 52, has a system for managing tourism, and it's called a tourism tax. And I think we are just multi years behind at looking at really resolving the issues. So I'm rather disappointed that you aren't able to hint at somebody with some bright ideas looking to resolve them. Thank you.
Did that come through clearly for the Zoomers? It was okay, sorry.
The tourism tax, there are 2 slightly separate aspects. One is, it's easier to, in principle, to tax people when they come into the country. And that's one way of doing it. Another way is if you happen to live in the other end of England and you want to come up to the Lake District, rather like the congestion charge. Are you suggesting, and I'm not saying I'm not sympathetic, Are you suggesting one or both, or how's it going?
Well, I've just come back from a trip to Switzerland.
Yes,
The Swiss are also complaining about over tourism, but they have been extremely good at developing their tourism.
yes.
But I pay, wherever I stay, I pay a tourism.
On the
They
accommodation.
make sure there's
Yeah, that's
damn
fine.
good services that keep
Yes.
the roads.
And if
open.
you're a Swiss person doing the same, staying the same way, do you pay equally?
Yes.
Yes,
that's
yeah.
just-
No, I said
Yeah.
I'm trying to tease out ideas from people,
Yeah, yeah.
see what they think, because it's one thing for me to think of something.
That's the same in France, the same.
Yeah, I
in
noticed.
Australia. It's the same in USA.
We
We are the only country that hasn't done anything.
I know, we have set our face against that, and it may be we are wrong, but it's quite interesting, if you talk to the visitor economy people, they're terribly against it, because they say it will reduce their activities. Now, the jury's out on that, I think, actually, it'll change it, it'll rebalance it slightly, but it doesn't necessarily kill it.
Miles, first of all.
Yeah, following on from that, I think there's a huge risk that the Lake District will become saturated. With 20 million visitors, 18 to 20 million visitors, the vast majority of whom come for the day. So, if you have a bed tax, which is what we're talking about, possibly only 8 or 10 million people actually stay overnight. I'm conjecturing these figures.
You're not far.
Whereas, with a
Bit
congestion charge,
too high, but not too bad.
if you had a congestion charge, 20 million people paid £1 each. Those 20 million pounds keep the base up and the roads and make the environment and all the rest of it. But like you, I was on the National Park Authority for 4 years, and a certain number of members were proposing this, a congestion charge. I mean, if it works in London, it can easily work for the lakes with nothing.
I mean, technology means you
The
could do
technology
it
is there.
now, which you couldn't even
Yeah.
relatively few years ago, this sort of charge.
But you're right to say that the businesses didn't like the idea. Although, quite honestly, if you pay 2 or 3 or 5 euros on your hotel bill, you don't even notice it. But there was resistance from the businesses, and also the officers of the National Park didn't favour it. That might change when there's a change of leadership in the National Park. But I just think it's essential, because otherwise the park will become saturated. Trying to get people out of their cars. So maybe this would, perhaps you would pay per car, you'd encourage people to share cars. If you want to get people out of your cars, you've got to have somewhere to park them. That's a huge problem with parking, not only at this end of the valley, but all over the lakes. And again, I think some form of visitor tax, congestion charge, call it what you want, is essential, but there doesn't seem to be a support for it.
No, I mean, there is a strong argument for it, but I agree, it's not universally supported. And another aspect of this is that the Treasury don't like and set their face against hypothecated levies. Because that is the British tradition of raising money. It may be this is changing. We're beginning to see it in 1 or 2 areas. I think the way, for example, that the future funding of the BBC is being talked about is the BBC license fee, in whatever form it takes, is a form of hypothecated tax. It's not really a fee. Perhaps it should really be a fee. And there's an awful lot of debate around that. And I think that the kind of issues that we're talking about now in the context of this are quite close to the issues that relate to the BBC license fee.
I wrote a paper on eco-tax. I remember I was absolutely passionately involved, and I was involved with the mayor, then mayor of Kendal, and they made some very extraordinary and positive. They had some very positive conclusions that would come out of this, and it was completely technically possible. It was possible to ring fence the money that was generated. But it's like a lot of these ideas, it gets sort of floats and then gradually gets shot down and disappears. Now, I was going to raise a question about the Glover report, which was a wonderful exercise at one stage in trying to find ways of addressing these issues. And there wasn't really a forum for gathering all this information. So it was a lot of stuff and energy went into it, and then it just collapsed like a souffle. So all that energy was really generated trying to bounce ideas off each other. And just British system seems to just allow all this to trickle through the planks and it disappears.
But it may be that if this is becoming obviously and publicly a concern all over the world, that may change the political environment in which we're operating in terms of thinking about it here. I mean, a piece like that in the FT just was, I think, July the 23rd. It was, very recent. Is evidence that this is really becoming a much bigger issue on a wider canvas than it has been hitherto.
Judith,
Tim, I'm really interested to know if everybody in the room thinks a visitor tax of some kind is a good idea, whether it's a residential tax or an entry tax. On entry, it's obviously terribly straightforward. You go to the Penrith Sainsbury's and you pay. So that can be done. I would really like you to take a poll because I don't know. I'm completely in favour of both.
okay, as a challenge, how many people in the room would like an eco tax of some sort? That's about 85%.
Most, but not all.
What about the Zoomers? Can they do the equivalent?
Take time.
Is it taking time? Let's see. Can you reach 85%? Zoomers, are they on the same line or not? But I mean, there's books and articles written about it, but it's one of these things that's so much as a balloon of ideas, then actually British bureaucracy kills it.
But there are two separate ways of getting your hands on the money. You either have bed tax and you have some or some entry tax. The entry tax is now much easier than it ever used to be, because I thought it was for a long time when I was on the planning board. It struck me as being effectively impossible. But now that you've got congestion charge technology and so on, it's relatively straightforward because there aren't that many roads in that. And do people feel strongly in favour of one or the other?
Well, I think the entry tax or congestion charge, because it'll bring in more revenue.
Yeah.
And it could then, you have to say, that we're using this money to keep the park as it should be. Yes. The National Park, as you know, is struggling for money, always wearing your day and night. They never have enough money. Their income isn't guaranteed. They get half of their income from the government, which is not secure. The rest have to make their own resources. And there's never enough money to do the things they want to do. So
you have to make sure that the way in which the money is distributed is not necessarily part of the approach, but is generally accepted as being even-handed and fair, because different interest groups do have very different perspectives on this.
You know, I come from an African perspective, and wherever you go to national parks in Africa, you pay. You pay a charge, and there's a special fund which is allocated, and there are all sorts of worthy people on boards that allocate the resources, and it's peanuts. Although there are big variations. You know, if you go to a place like Galapagos, you pay $200 for 2-3 weeks or whatever. If you want to go and see a gorilla, if you want to go to Rwanda, it'll cost you $1,000.
No, but you go free.
And if you go, and if you're going to go to Uganda, it'll cost you $500 a day. But the fact is that this is part and parcel of the whole tourism process, that people have to pay for certain things, and the tourists themselves set quality standards.
Now, not every hand went up when Tim asked. Now, is there anybody here who'd like to articulate the argument, their views, why it's a mistake? No, that's all right. But again, there's always two sides of a coin, and it's important to hear everything.
But the argument I had from Richard Leaf for a long time, I'm sure I was saying, is that it was when the national parks were created, it was free for everyone, it's free access. You cannot. So this is enshrined in tablets somewhere that you can't touch that. That's something that was part of the whole process of creating national parks. Thou shalt not charge anyone. It's a free.
But it isn't really free, is it? Thinking about it as if you were a potential visitor, and every time you want to park somewhere in the national park, you're paying £8 for the day. I mean, I think if you're a visitor and you're paying a tax, you're going to say, well, fair enough, but I think then I should be able to park for free and not spend another £8 today, another £8 tomorrow. So there's a lot of money. Well, I think you have to think about the balance.
Just join the National Trust and you get it.
There's wheels within wheels, and also there is a difference between a tax and a charge. And in fact, you need to be, I think one needs to be quite clear in one's head about what it is you're actually looking to do. If you want to get some money off people in the way we're talking, because they're different.
Gordon, you wanted to raise
So
that?
the easy way is the government paying more money.
The government's trying to, that's another point altogether.
20 million, let's put 20 million out of it. And that then is raised, then this is recess and raised per tax.
But I think in the short term, one's got to approach these problems. The perspective is the government's not going to put in
Yeah.
more money. Sorry.
Gordon.
Yeah, the national parks were created for, at the end of the Second World War, for, I guess, in recognition of all the people who fought and died, and therefore, it should be essentially like the National Health Service, free for public use. And I think that's a principle that shouldn't be changed. If it's to be funded, it shouldn't be funded by a tourism tax. The other reason why I'm against the tax is because I enjoy visiting other national parks. And as someone who lives in Britain, I don't feel I should have to pay for it.
Because you're already paying for it through national taxation.
Through national taxation.
And the problem, of course, is that there isn't enough national taxation to go round. I mean, you know, I'm just trying to.
Absolutely, I can understand the problems, but as a point of principle, I don't feel we should have to, you know, as British citizens, we should have to pay to visit parts of our own country.
Yeah. Would you do when you go to London?
And the congestion charge.
Yeah. But it's the same sort of thing, actually. If you look at the Russian, I mean, I'm not trying to argue it either way. I'm just trying to probe around. But the reason you have the congestion charge is that there are various things in London which need doing, basically.
But if I go on the train, I don't get to pay, so maybe.
Yes, well, maybe they should levy something on the ticket to Euston. I do it.
Are there any questions online?
We've had a few responses to would you be in favour of the tax on the national park? Mainly or in principle, yes. Risk of unintended consequences if not carefully thought through, though, obviously. One question: what about inclusivity and accessibility if taxing is
Inclusive what?
just inclusivity and accessibility. Based on travel arrangements, i.e. environmental impact / carbon footprint, etc., income level. So I guess that's slightly an extension of what Gordon was just saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a problem. I mean, there's a problem that some of the things that the national park offers are very difficult to be completely enjoyed by people with certain sorts of disability. That's the reality of it. And I don't think you can get around that. And it's arguable sometimes that by trying to do that, you actually degrade the experience for which the national park was intended in the first place. But it's not straightforward. But certainly, I think you're right, and I hope I made the point that, you know, that it is a national park, and it is for people who are less well off as well as people who are better off.
I was going to raise a general point following your analysis of the different issues which have to be tackled. And my basic principle would be by small is beautiful approach, and rather like the question, how do you eat an elephant? The answer is in small bites. And I would say that in Ullswater, we have a lot of people in the community who are really concerned about the future, and there are community groups that sprung up to try to find solutions, whether it's on sustainable transport or hopper buses, or whether it's our little group trying to look at heritage issues and awareness generation, or communities, their campsites, which have got world record top standing, who really investing in sustainability options and renewable energy and so on. And it seems to me that, and we raised it at a previous talk when we talked about sustainable tourism, I think we should encourage local communities, value by value if necessary, to how that sort of reflects and engage with the local community and then bring in the government at the time and time was right to engage them, but at least just have a bottom up.
Is this want a better way of putting it, saying you want to give more money to and spending capacity to parish councils?
That could be an answer, yes, but I don't know. But
I heard some head shaking, you know, this is, because it's all good stuff until you work out how you can actually do it yourself, mate.
The bus from Penrith to Keswick used to stop at Penruddock all the time, but now every other bus stops at Penruddock. This is to transport tourists quicker from Penrith railway station to Keswick. That's what will offset locals against tourism. It's just so unfair that we, as residents, can't drive to Penruddock to get the bus anymore regularly. It's things like that that need to be looked at, because tourism, I work in tourism, but tourism has now dominated everything, and the campsites in this area are dominating this whole area. And I just think that as a resident, I understand the economy of tourism is important, but as a resident, I think we are second-class citizens to the tourists.
I'm interested, nobody's ready to talk about housing, but let's, sorry, I'd be interested to know people's views about housing and how you deal with the housing issues. Sorry, there's a hand at the back. Ronnie, sorry, I didn't.
It wasn't about housing. I was really going to say about so many things. But buses and the thing about buses. Yeah, I can go with writing a book called Wayne Lights Without a Bus. Sorry, Wayne Lights Without a Car. It's coming out in September time, so I'll be looking for buses. And interesting about Penruddock. Well, Greystoke has had a bus for years, and the X4, X5 should alternate or something. So there's that aspect there. But what I was thinking about is that there's been a big push to bring more people in. I was talking to the lady from National Park the other day. I thought with increased numbers of visitors, but since before COVID, we haven't. But people are going to different places. They're going to these pools, and they've got Scotland Pike in the mine. So it's created all these hot pots of things, and also going to, I suppose, I think Keswick the other day, it was actually healing people, but top of Winlatter, there was nobody, just me. So we've got, things have changed, I think as Richard said, which over the time since 1950, sort of people came to the lakes because it was the hills and we're going to go to the hills. Now it's these pools and other places, and do we want that? I think that
Very pools.
yes, or should we be thinking that this is the mountains, and we should be thinking that is the Lake District is the mountain, not a new paddling pool in.
I don't know whether everybody understands about fairy pools, but I'm a Blue Badge tourist guide, and I just did a tour with a family from India who wanted to go to the fairy pools in Eskdale. And funnily enough, unfortunately, I refused to take them. And funnily enough, that week on the mountain rescue program, there was somebody who dislocated his shoulder diving into the fairy pools in Eskdale. And I was so pleased that I said, no, I'm not taking you. And they read it online to go to a fairy pool, and they were desperate to go to a fairy pool.
Why?
Because they crystal clear water, fresh water to swim in. They were from India, wind in their hair.
Yeah.
It's to do with the internet and what is.
The internet has such an extraordinary impact in all sorts of ways on the lives we lead. And I think particularly on the lives of people who use it more than I do.
Judith, I was going to ask you on the housing issue. You have you're extremely well briefed on social housing in Glenridding and how it's ground had lots and lots.
And John Miles is doing
Yes.
a bit further back.
Okay. But the issues, if I understood at some stage, there was a move within the council really to create more appropriate housing for locals. And a plan was drawn up, and then it got blocked because of sewage.
No, we're stuck in nutrient neutrality.
Yes,
So on that day
that's a hugely controversial
Which is-
topic. It was
it's not about, do you encourage very small scale affordable housing for locals? Or do you say the environmental regulations?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not disputing. I say controversial. I meant I was referring to that sort of issue. That
And
sort of
that's
problem.
very difficult, because the lake is dirty.
Yeah,
And you are not replacing systems along these lakes because they're concentrating on Windermere, just had brilliant campaigning.
Yes.
That's not against you, it's a perfectly sensible decision from their point of view. It has meant damage for other areas.
yes. I mean, that's
That's a real problem.
yeah. That's why I said it was controversial, because it cuts across. See,
Can you just summarise this? If I understand it, it's just been rejected by United Utilities or something because
No.
the sewage.
Too complicated to do. United Utilities are going to be forced to replace the systems at the far end of the lake by 2030, as are all water companies allegedly. I mean, I don't know the details of that, but it's not my.
The housing can't be built because of sewage issues, is that
Yes,
correct?
because the current systems are overloaded in a number of
That's it.
areas. But I mean,
So
the
it's all up
ancient
to-
systems, they've been there since before most buildings were born. So,
but the
you know,
problem is, I was on North West Water Authority
Oh,
long ago, and in the old days when it was basically a kind of collective of local authorities.
Exactly.
The one thing that was sort of agreed by every member from everywhere was there was no money in digging holes in the ground, pouring money into, no votes, pouring money into the holes in the ground, covering them up again. So you've got 3 generations worth of underinvestment, and it's a real problem in the real world, isn't it?
And it's very important for the lakes to be cleaner.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
nobody has any issue. The issue here is this catchment, which goes to Carlisle, is very
Yeah.
big and complicated. And it will move, I'm sure. but
And it'll take an awful long
Well,
time.
we've been stuck for 3 years already, so
Yeah.
yes, fine.
But if you're waiting for a house for 73 years, you haven't got much time to enjoy living in it, have you?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that something must be done to provide housing for local people, or for people working in the area. I mean, we estimate there are over 150 people working in Fully Bridge. And the vast majority of them come to the village every day, because their employers can't afford to buy, to put them up, and they can't afford to buy anything. There are people stuck in big houses who want to move out to smaller houses for their families. And something has to be done, and as Judith echoes, it's like pushing one uphill, but whenever you choose the site, subjected to, but something has to be done. It's absolutely no doubt.
I mean, there's enormous tax incentives to do B&Bs and I mean Airbnb and tourism things. And I must say, I've wondered for some time whether that was really sensible. It'd be much better to loosen up the rules around letting and the tax related aspects of letting houses people to live in, than it is to encourage ever more numbers of people coming in. I think that particular perspective is we need to gain a bit of traction, but I'm not sure. What do people think here?
Yeah, I'm sure just agree. You think Airbnb, I never actually stayed in Airbnb, but I think it was really brought in for people to let out a lot of room here and there. And now it's just got bigger and bigger, and people now buying houses
Yes.
specifically for Airbnbs. So it's totally out of control. And as you say, it's taking up housing, which should be available for locals or whatever.
I mean, I'm president of the Lakeland Housing Trust, which goes back to the 30s. And what it's done, and it's difficult to do, is it has bought and or has been bequeathed residential property, which old houses, not new, not modern stuff, not the contemporary social housing, which it then lets by virtue of being a charity, but not a housing association, which it lets to local people in communities in order they can live in it. And that seems to me, I'm very keen on that, but it's a very expensive way of providing accommodation, because you're having to dip into the open market to get something that's nearer the top than the bottom. of the price range, but it is a way of sort of committing local people to a community so that they can stay there. And interestingly, a number of the houses that we've got have been left by people in their wills, who have then got their executors have managed to get the tax benefits from leaving the thing to charities. And if it is a testator whose heirs don't necessarily want a house here, it's quite an attractive option. But if on the other hand, if you want to live in it yourself as a child, previous owner, it's not so good.
You said at the beginning you don't want any conclusions from the session, but I mean you set the ball rolling. I mean, what as a group here, is there anything sensible that we can do in terms of responding to the gauntlet which you've thrown down? I mean, I think there are enough people here with an interest who've got very strong views on the other, who've been at it for a long time. There's probably quite a lot of frustration in the room.
Well, there's clearly a lot of frustration in the room.
And the question is how to channel this into something which is productive and useful to someone. And when I said small is beautiful, I was thinking at least at the level of Ullswater, we have an Ullswater association, we have lots of bodies who are sitting together. I would say that the first shot at trying to solve, if you can call it that, the issue, the triangulation issues you refer to, is for a group of people who are already part of an association that has, I think, some clout. I mean, it's quite moribund in a way, but at least it's representative. To sort of charge the association, or the Ullswater Association itself, to start engaging in this issue and put ideas on the table. Well, not just ideas, but solutions, because I think most of us would like to be solution oriented if possible.
I mean, on one level, you've all got your ideas and your solutions in your minds. They're
Sure.
not all the same quite.
Sure.
It's sort of getting the thing moved on to get the framework within which things can happen change, because that's the problem. I mean, in farming, for instance, farmers think that they're completely independent. Actually, they're operating in a marketplace which is completely controlled by the government. And similarly in housing, there is a market, but that market rules are set by the government in London. And they don't necessarily look at the problems from the perspective that we do here, and it's persuading them. I mean, we've got new MP, well, not here, we've got, is it new MP here?
An old,
New to you.
Tim Farron.
Well, I mean, again,
Yeah.
I mean, we know that he's been interested in
Yeah,
the
very
project about these
Yeah.
issues. And maybe that you want to attack, if that's the right word, or suck up to, or persuade, or cajole, the other new MPs to get them to push pressure. But the problem we've got is that it's a topic which everybody agrees is one that needs being addressed. But when it comes to finding solutions that are acceptable to everybody from the bureaucrats to the big politicians in London,
Sure.
people on the ground, it doesn't seem to be easy to find any kind of common consensus.
Well, we've asked Tim Farron
Yes.
to come here in October.
Right.
Can change happen from the bottom up, or is it always are we always gonna be controlled from the top down? I mean, how do you get a small community like this
Well, that's
to
Well,
make change?
The glib answer, which is unhelpful, is to find out a Melvin Bragg who lives in your community and then get them to be our champion. Because in the real world we're in now, it's that kind of advocacy which is often the most effective at cutting through layers of inertia in the system. But you can't necessarily do that. And I think it's difficult. I mean, I think pestering MPs and pestering senior figures in the housing world, or whatever it is you're concerned about, is a good plan. But for in a way, why you sound like a track record, don't you? And then it has problems that comes with it.
Does it not need to go a little bit along the lines of a devolution to an area or a
Well,
region?
yeah, we're going to see devolution, and the government has written to Cumberland and Westmoreland suggesting they ought to form a combined mayoral authority. Now, whether they will or whether they won't, but we won't necessarily find that devolve power to Cumberland Westland will help. It just depends.
I'm just kind of thinking, because Joe and I quite often used to go skiing in the Dolomites in Italy. And the Dolomites of the region has quite a strong local presence. And basically, it's a requirement. You can't buy a place there. You have to be a local resident and local taxes. So they've actually managed to enforce that, but only in the Dolomites. You step outside of the regional area and then you can buy a place. And somehow they've created that regional control and devolution. And they've got the whole group of families who are spread out and kind of maintain the local presence. And they've created the tourism industry and the skiing and the mountain walking. And it's a vibrant area. And it works for them. I just don't understand how you could get it to work in the UK on a regional basis.
I mean, it's an approach which offers considerable attractions in the context of the issues we're talking about now. But then you'll find a whole string of other arguments are advanced about, you know, the right of people to own property and this and that and the other, which are not derisory at all. And somehow we have it's probably true of every country, every community, you know, there are different perspectives on what really matters.
Because I think you said you could build 1 million houses in the Lake District. It wouldn't make any difference because external investment money would come into
Yes.
soak them up.
I mean,
If
there is,
it's actually restricted to people who live in the area, pay taxes in the area, then there wouldn't be that external investment coming.
but how do you
in.
become
And
a
it would keep
person?
prices
How do you
down.
become a person who lives in the area and pays taxes there? You have to marry a girl who lives there, or
I don't know.
you know, this is the kind of thing
I
that
don't know how it works in the Dolomites. They
No.
do allow people to come in, like tourist companies, to buy,
yeah.
or not buy, but buy 5 years at a time of a chalet. And they make the,
Yes,
money out of that.
everybody's keen on investment, outside investment. I think if you're not careful, you end up in a kind of neo-colonial arrangement where there is clearly some money which is spent in the community. But if it's money from the Middle East or China or whatever, profits are going to go back there and they're not going to stay here. What we want is more investment being then recycled
Yeah.
in the local community.
But if you keep it locally owned and locally taxed, but allow inward investment for periods of time to like let it off for people who own it,
I
the
understand.
money would stay in the area, would it not?
Well,
And the
more-
tax money would stay more in the area.
but it's not an approach that's been found attractive in this country, is all I can say.
There's a lot of things in this country which
Just said one last question to go. I realise the time is flying, and I've seen Anne at the corner.
There's more.
Oh, there's more.
Two
questions, okay.
Have them both.
Interestingly, we've just had relatives staying with us from Kent. And they have local plans. They've been asked within their local area or whatever. Canterbury's a law unto itself in the sense that it's a huge honeypot there, so the city, they sort their taxes or whatever, out in that way. But each area has been asked to produce a plan according to their local needs, which are largely housing, health, education, and the rest. And they don't have a mayor. Why do we need a mayor? It's another layer of government. It's another layer that we have to pay for. If Kent County Council can put a plan together, or try to put a plan together, what is the opposition when it comes to Cumberland and Westmoreland and Furness?
Well, push at the door and see what happens. There is the new rules coming in literally since the election about local
Yes,
plans and
yeah,
planning.
fair enough.
And that may then achieve some of the things you're looking for. But the end of the day, the crucial thing is not the plan, it's the implementation of the plan.
Oh, for sure it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I was just going to say that problem with affordable houses for locals in tourism areas is not just Cumbria, you know, it's Cornwall and all sorts of places. So it's not just one
No, no.
MP or two MPs who are interested. It's going to be a group of them who quite a lot of MPs who think something about the same problem. So it's not just one voice in the room, it's kind of that.
No, absolutely. But the problem is that are we looking at the problem the right way? It's normally seen as something that you ought to do through a lot of it through the public sector. Perhaps I suspect in communities such as the one here, if you made it attractive to the private sector to put conditions on occupation to do with local occupancy. If the government was prepared to make it attractive, I think you'd get quite a big take up. But they don't. They're not interested in looking at it that way.
Do you know Lord Ricketts?
Sorry,
Lord Ricketts, the
Ridley?
CEO of
Ricketts.
Arsenal.
Ricketts.
Trade.
He was on the radio a few weeks ago and he was saying that one of the big things that could be done to release property for affordable housing was flats above shops. Loads of them apparently get empty and I don't know why and I can't recall what he said the block or the problem was. But it just occurs to me from walking around Penrith. There's so much empty shop frontage and flats above or anyway, something above shops that could be lived in. You just wonder what the issues are that are making.
I think it's hugely complicated to do with building regulations, planning consents, and things like how do you organise a whole string of things. The answer is it's absolutely right. It's getting it done. It's getting the people to play ball. And of course, if it's a good place to have a cannabis factory, perhaps there's more money in there.
That's a good note to end on. There are two things I have to do, and then I'll pass the floor to Gordon to say a few words. Firstly, donations. We try to gather money from talks such as yours, and we normally have a system where 50% of any proceeds go to ourselves and 50% go to a charity nominated by you. Do you have any thoughts on what you may?
Not on my head. You look Lakeland Housing Trust.
Lakeland Housing Trust. Okay. The second thing I wanted to say is the next talk will take place on Thursday, the 5th of September, and will be given by Mark Vowles, or Vowles, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but the owner, Vowles, thank you very much, of the 1863 restaurant hotel in Pulley and he's going to talk. He hasn't yet got a title, but it's about his vision for the restaurants and quality tourism and so on. But in fact, it follows very, very closely the debate today. So it will take place at Parkhill Memorial Hall in Pulley, Mark Vowles. And with that, I will pass the floor to Gordon, who is our chair. Very pleased that
Thank you, Richard. One of the unique privileges of being chair of the Friends of the Ullswater Way is you get to have the last word. But tonight, I don't think it is going to be the last word. I think it's more like the first word with the first words. Because, as Richard said, are the concerns genuine? And I think the fact that you're all here tonight is there are some genuine concerns about what is happening in tourism in Cumbria and more specifically in Ullswater itself. I don't believe that, contrary to what Richard said, that the future is to the strongest. And we only need to look at the dinosaurs to see that, or the biggest. It's to those who are agile and who are the best. And so it's how do we set Ullswater up to be the most agile and the best. And one of the leading proponents of the national park movement, going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, was a guy called Theodore Roosevelt, who was president of the United States. And what he said was, do what you can with what you have where you are. And so I think it's probably incumbent, not necessarily upon Friends of the Ullswater Way, but upon the Ullswater community to do what it can where it is with what we have. The impact we can have on national legislation is minute. We can have some influence on the national park and what they do. And to be honest, the biggest landholders in the national park are firstly the National Trust and secondly the national park themselves. So if we can move them to actually start doing things, then perhaps we will be able to get something done here in Ullswater. Now, those of you who remember, Friends of the Ullswater Way came about by from two sources. The first one was the valley planning, Ullswater Valley planning, which was part of our World Heritage status bid, because the national park didn't have consultation as a tick in their World Heritage status application box. So, and Ullswater was the guinea pig, the pilot, call it what you will, and it was very, very successful. It had the effect of bringing all 5 of the parishes and the parish councils together, and I feel as though we achieved a lot. The second one was a disaster, Storm Desmond, which also pushed the Friends of the Ullswater Way to come into being as something positive to come out of Storm Desmond and to start the healing process that the valley greatly needed. So, as Friends of the Ullswater Way, I feel we can act perhaps as facilitators, and perhaps tonight will be a catalyst to bring some kind of valley planning process back together to do what we can, and perhaps be leaders and influencers in terms of what we can do to the Greater Lake District to evolve it to a greater success. Because like Richard, I don't feel, and I think most of you feel, that we can't carry on with the current pathway. We're on a recipe to disaster and to the detriment of everyone, the residents and of course the visitors alike. So for initiating this discussion, Richard, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed, and on behalf of everyone else, if you can just show.